Thank you very much, and thank you for the very warm welcome. I would just like, first of all, to apologise to those who heard my husband giving me my coffee, but I too am a learner, and I suppose there's a diversity of need in that learning. I am sorry that I'm not there with you. I was actually in your lovely university many years ago working on an Erasmus project. And at that time, we were also focused on inclusion in academia and in the classroom. And I think since I've been to Ljubljana, which was back in about 2008, 2009, certainly the discourse, the research, the conversation in relation to inclusion in higher education and across education has increased, and the voice of learners is growing louder in this space all the time. What I'm hoping to do here today is share some of my learning and my experience with you. But I too am open to learning. So I am very happy if you want to post a comment, if you want to pause me to ask me a question, or even make a comment on what I'm saying. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some discussion, because I would like to also hear your thoughts in this regard. Um, so I suppose my title slide there shows a watch, and it actually shows some quotes from a pop song. I won't sing it for you. It's too early in the morning in Ireland. It's 9 o'clock here. But I think there's one line in it that really struck me as I've developed my work in this area, both in terms of research and practice over the years. And it's that feeling that people get when they hear there's another framework coming. And this in Ireland at the moment, this is corrections time. People have a lot of correcting to do. There's a lot of work on. It's a very, very busy time in higher education. And it's the line, I can't do what 10 people tell me to do. So I guess I'll remain the same. And I think this is something that sometimes happens. It's, oh my goodness, and not another way, not another thing, not something else I have to do, because time is of the essence. So I'm using time as a framework for this presentation. Now, I've been introduced to you already, but what I will say is that this presentation will involve PowerPoint with images and text on the slides. Where the images are important, I will speak to them, otherwise they're really only decorative. I won't always be reading the text, I will be speaking a presentation, so the text really is for something to go back to afterwards, and it's often as much for me as it is for yourselves. So, as I said, this presentation will involve PowerPoint with images and text and slides, and I will speak to the images. So in the first instance, what I'd like to ask you, and Marisa might even help me, I'd like some of you to raise your hands. It's a very busy time of the year. And I want just to know how many of you struggle with managing your time. Just a quick hand raise. Or are you all very good at time management? Okay, we're seeing some hands popping up. We've very good time managers, I think, in Slovenia, a little bit more than we do in Ireland. It's certainly a struggle here. But in terms of if you do manage your time well, how many of you have a coping strategy or have an approach for managing your time? Very good. We're seeing some hands raised again. And I suppose what I want you to reflect on, because time is a common challenge for any worker in any environment, be it education or otherwise, is that anytime you're under pressure, is it the same coping strategy? Just reflect on it a little bit in your head. Is it the same coping strategy you use every time? Because I would hasten to add that it perhaps actually is not. And it's a common struggle. And I suppose time is something that we all struggle with at some occasion. But similarly, we all struggle to include, because including is an ongoing challenge. And it's time to view inclusion as a shared opportunity rather than a personal challenge. And that is really where our presentation is going to take us today. So, in the first instance, I suppose what we all need to appreciate is we just stop and think about ourselves. We need to think from a place of empathy, and we need to appreciate, irrespective of whether somebody has a disability, a difference, whether they're older, whether it's gender, we are all challenged differently. Sometimes it can be by the same thing, sometimes it's not, but in each situation, each challenge will have more than one solution. And it's taking from this kind of thinking that universal design step originated, because it basically appreciated the intersectionality of people and appreciated that there are so many different ways that you can design an activity, a product, or a place, and yet it will still work for everybody. But the challenge is how to capture that and how to do that and how to redesign, but redesigning while understanding your audience. Now, what we all need to do in the first instance is to stop and think about how time has framed how we approach difference and how we approach inclusion. And I think it's something we don't often give a regard to, because we are all coming from a culture, from a time, from a context when sometimes difference was promoted. If we go back to the 1950s, which it would have been my parents' generation, it was very much about segregated education. People with difference went to different schools. Indeed, in Ireland, you still have girls going to girls' schools, boys going to boys' schools in parts of the country, something they're still looking at challenging. And religion also divides schools. There was also a big difference in relation to class and money. There was a changing world of work, because there was an appreciation now that more people needed to be doing different things. And education started to respond. In the 1980s, the thinking around inclusion started to shift, particularly in the space of vocational psychology and career guidance, because they started to appreciate that women and other cultural minorities were now also included in the workplace. It sounds difficult to believe it, but up to that point, much of the research really was just considering workplace in relation to men. And inclusive design thinking started to emerge in relation to products and buildings, not so much so yet in relation to education. In the 1990s up to the 2000s was when we started to see a plethora of legislation and policies coming from Europe, from the UN, across the world, and certainly nationally here in Ireland. And I'm sure if you look to your own legislative system, you'll find that when it did come, that it was promoted by activities that were taking part in the wider demographic. And the changes in demographics in education and work were continuing to change. We were starting to see a lot of firsts. We were starting to see the first person with a disability who was a doctor, the first person, the first woman be as something else. But they had all had a journey through education, and technology was starting to make a strong impact and starting to become a key feature in our learning and work environments. And from 2010, we've had much more development since. And most recently now we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which will start to frame our thinking in relation to inclusion further again. So I suppose what I'm really trying to drive at here, without boring you too much this early in the morning, and it's 9 here, I know it's a little later there, is that we need to start thinking about, you're all academics, you're working as teachers, maybe starting to think about what frames you're thinking about inclusion. Certainly in the disability space, there's models of disability. There's the medical model, which looks at fixing people and is more about a power dynamic than it is about the fix. It is really about the person believing that they have all the answers and that they know the way and that they know the right way. Then the social model started to emerge, where it was basically considered that society needed to start to appreciate disability and difference a bit more, resulting in very often what we now appreciate were add-on accommodations, add-on adjustments, or add-on changes, such as maybe the ramp to the side of a building, rather than redesigning the steps to the forefront. Or maybe in the classroom, it would have been where somebody was given extra resource or sent to a special class for support. And now we're moving towards that space where we need to think about redesigning our approaches so that people feel like they not only can participate, but also that they belong in our learning environments and our learning social environments also. The legacy, however, of that traditional mindset is that we very often quickly move to that space of where the first answer is an add-on support. That if somebody presents, and particularly in the area of disability, if somebody presents who has a visual impairment or who has who's deaf or who has a physical disability, that very often it's, well, okay, that's not something I entirely understand. That's not something I really know what to do. I'm going to call in the expert. Or it can be, where the student's told, you need to go to sort that out. But very often there's very little thought given to our own teaching practice, our own curriculum, our curriculum development, and our own assessment procedures, which would take our time as opposed to somebody else's time. And what UDL is, in essence, if it was, for some of you, you may be aware of it already, but what you really need to appreciate is it's not a tick box, it's not a checklist, it's not a template. It is both a philosophy and a practice that seeks to design for the greatest diversity of people. But disability is to the forefront because disability is enshrined in legislation. We need to accommodate for disability. It is best practice, but it's where we make that accommodation and we stop and we think, okay, I'm going to make this change for somebody with a disability. And we reflect on, is this going to work for other students as well? And how well will it work for other students? So while we think back to the past, what I want again is you to think for a moment, what challenges did our colleagues have in the past that we don't have today? And if somebody would like to pop something into the chat, maybe just a reflection. Any thoughts about challenges that maybe people in academia had in the past, back in the 80s and 90s, that we do not have today? Or do you believe it was all good? I believe that I suppose some of the challenges that people might have had in the past was that when somebody who was different presented, and indeed even in some engineering courses it could have been a female who presented, that they really didn't know where to go to or who to talk to, and they didn't know where to find an answer, and they felt very much alone in that. I suppose in terms of the new challenges as we evolve towards it that we have today on our campus, is that there are so many places we can go, and there is so much information, and there is so much ready information that we need to be able to stand back and know what's truth and what's not, and be ready to respond accordingly. And in that, before we dip into universal design, I suppose what we're really stopping to think about is who our learning matters for. And fundamentally, our learning matters in this lecture for our students, because what we're seeking to do is optimize their success. We're viewing every student as they come into our classroom as having the potential to engage in our curriculum, the potential to learn what we're teaching, the potential to engage in assessment, and the potential to engage with the wider college life. And sometimes when we work with people with difference in disability, we think it's only in the classroom we need to think about the changes that we need to make. And that is not necessarily the case. So while what we've touched on is, where we need to think about owning, I suppose, our own approaches, and need to be a little bit aware as we get into the space of maybe any unconscious bias that we might have, and some of the philosophies that we're aligned to, and the theories and practice that we work in. We also need to step back and think of all of this as a place of opportunity, because this is our time to redesign for inclusion. For the first time, we have the legislation, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the policies, we have the information, and we have a growing demographic of people that are researching and exploring in this area and sharing their learning in a very willing way. And, redesigning is something, I suppose, that we're actually doing in so many other quarters of our lives that it's not new to any of us, while we might take it for granted. And I don't know if I have any colleagues here from architecture or product design, but universal design started from design theory. And one design theorist that I particularly liked was Den Decker. And I suppose when he stopped to think about design, he was thinking about it in terms of a way of working, that it's how you approach your work. He also highlighted that it thrives on relationships. It's about asking people, what do you believe will work here? What has worked for you? Being able to engage with people about aspects that maybe we don't feel so knowledgeable in. It's about having access to choices, and it's consciously deciding what you want, but it can be messy. So if we stop to think for a moment of the last time we'd redesigned something in our lives, be it our kitchen, be it our bedroom, be it our garden, and we stop and think about what did we first do? For some, they might take to the internet or social media, try and find a picture of what they like, and they start to build choices in terms of, I might like this, I might like this, or I might like this. For others, it might be that they build up a mood board, that they go out and they view friends' houses, they talk to people about, what works best for you. So they're starting to develop a way of working, and they're thriving on their relationships with others. And as you develop your thinking, you will appreciate this, that sometimes you'll decide, well, I think I'd like that. You may start to implement it and then think, no, it's actually, this isn't going to work for me. So yes, of course, it can be messy. But one of the key things that the design thinking has brought into education, while for years we have been including, but we've been including more of as a reaction, is that universal design is starting to shift it to that conscious decision of deciding to design our classrooms and our learning environments in anticipation of the student with a disability who might come. The subtle shift is that perhaps 20, 30 years ago, a teacher in a classroom or an academic in a university would not have designed their classroom for a deaf student if they've never had a deaf student, because they'd say, sure, I'll wait till that deaf student comes. I do not need to think about this. Or a student who's different, or an older student. As you can see, I'm not exactly a young woman. I'd like to think I'm not an old woman yet either, but I went back to college in my midlife to engage in my PhD. I was that student. Yes, I was professional, but I was also a learner. So I wasn't the typical student in many regards. And what it necessitates is that conscious decision to decide to redesign our curriculum, our assessment, and our learning environments in anticipation of the students that are coming. So just a quick poll to check that you're all awake and with me, if that's okay. I want you to give me a thumbs up on, do you know, or how many of you know what universal design for learning is? Are we getting any thumbs up? Okay. How many of you do not know what universal design for learning is? Very good. How many of you know what universal design is? I can see Marisa has been running the polls, and we can see, and I will share with you, that there is about 66% of you that are comfortable applying UDL in your work. Okay. Very good. So we have about a 50-50. So with that in mind, I'm going to speak, I suppose, to those that haven't heard it and don't know it. So I'd appreciate patience from those that have, and hope that you pick up something from my learning and can also share something of your own learning in that. So very often people come to UDL because they have engaged with the CAST model, which I'll touch on later, but they don't always or haven't always heard of universal design. And it's the place I want to start, because universal design for learning is grounded in universal design. And universal design was developed by a researcher called Mace, who was a man with a physical disability in the US, taking his PhD in architecture. And he basically was looking at design and design thinking in that space. And he came up with the idea that, look, if we were to design from the get-go or from the beginning in anticipation for a wide diversity of people, what kind of framework would help or facilitate that? And he developed 7 steps, which I'm going to run through here, because it is those 7 steps that act as the foundation for any framework of universal design for learning that we might use. Excuse me. Principle 1 is the first step, and it's about equitable use. And it's where you stop to think about whatever you're designing, whether it's your classroom, whether it's your curriculum, whether it's your PowerPoint, that you basically think about the design being useful and marketable to people with diverse needs, but the diversity of people, including those with a disability. And what we mean by this is that their experience should feel the same, having engaged in whatever it is you design, that the product will offer the same means of use, identical where possible, but equivalent when not. Ultimately, it avoids segregating or stigmatizing any user. Nobody should feel different because of it. Provisions for privacy, security, and safety are equally available, and the design should be appealing. It shouldn't feel clunky. It shouldn't feel that somebody has to come in by a back door. It shouldn't feel like they have to go outside of a room to do something different or to learn different. It should appeal. Really good design. And if we pull on the remote control as an example, which was developed for people with physical disabilities and paraplegics, but it's something now that every one of us use, and we do not get off the sofa. Really good design is when other learners say, that will work for me. I also want to use that. Principle 2 is where there's a flexibility in use. That while the design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities, that there is choice in methods and use. So that if I am choosing to use it one way and it doesn't work for someone else to do it that way, that they can choose to use it another way. Now, we do this already in our daily lives. We accommodate for right or left-handed access and use, by way of example. And it's something that we very often take for granted and where we're often good at. And many of these principles, as I go through them, you'll find yourself believing and thinking, oh, I do that already. The shift is that you're consciously going to do it going forward. The principle 2 also facilitates the user's accuracy and precision, and it can adapt to user pace, where some people might be slow and careful, others quickly, but it will allow and accommodate for that. Principle 3 is tolerance for error. And this is where it is designed to understand, regardless of the user's experience, their background, their knowledge, their language skills, or indeed their concentration level. It is not unnecessarily complex. So very often when we think of technology or even an iPad, by way of example, and there's many a toddler will find their way around an iPad very quickly because it's quite intuitive. And there's very many simple and intuitive features built into it. Simple intuitive also means that it's consistent with user expectations and intuition, that users know what to expect, that there's no surprise. It will work with a wide range of literacy and language skills, and arranges information consistent with importance, so that people get to hear the most important thing first. It provides effective prompting and feedback both during and after task completion. So it brings learners or brings people through on a journey as they engage in using something. I often say to people, even opening up a Lego box, if you have, ever used Lego or have played with Lego, and looking at the Lego instructions. Lego instructions are simple and intuitive. And indeed now they're also being created for adults, not just children. Principle 4 is about perceptible information. And it's where the design communicates necessary information effectively. And it's taking the user's sensory abilities into consideration in this regard. And this is particularly important where there is sensory difficulties or sensory challenges. There can be different modes made available for essential information, pictorial, verbal, tactile. And there's an adequate contrast between the information and the surroundings. If you think of a lift that you last entered in a modern hotel, you'll find that the panel is very often perceptible, and particularly even when there's a voiceover in a very modern lift, that there can be braille on the buttons, that the buttons are very clearly labelled, you're very clearly told what floor reception is on and what floor other rooms are on, and there can be a voiceover in terms of what floor you're anticipating arriving at and what floor you're leaving. That would be perceptible information. So it's all of these moves to make it easier for everybody to engage in the process of what they're actually doing. Now, principle 5, I suppose, is one of my favourite principles, and I've already demonstrated that here today. And I suppose really what it's telling us is that there is tolerance for error built in. It is okay not to always get it right. And I think in the space of education, this is very important, because once you're consciously working trying to include students, there will always be changing needs. But it does not necessarily mean that it always works or it'll always get it right. But it's being able to stand back and reflect and learn from that each time. And this principle is what turns it from a checklist into a continuum, or turns it from something that is static into something that is a reflexive ongoing action. Because the tolerance for error will provide warnings of hazards and errors in a product, and does not use unconscious action for tasks that require vigilance. But in an action space like learning, when we apply it to universal design for learning, it's where then we can turn around and check in and see, well, what is going well here? What is not going well here? What needs to be improved? And we can take the time to continue to also improve our own performance as academics, teachers, researchers, assessors, etc. Principle 6 is low physical effort. And this is basically saying that while we've put all the other principles in place, this should not mean that something now is onerously long or complicated. In relation to a product, it will allow for a neutral body position. It uses reasonable operating forces. And I suppose, again, a nice example is when you have a very ergonomically friendly desk, computer, chair at a desk, etc. But the design is efficient and comfortable and does not result in fatigue from use. Principle 7 is where there is a size and space for approach and use. It's starting to take the person into consideration. There's appropriate size and space depending on the person that's being used. All elements can be reached comfortably, whether seated or standing. There is variations in hand and grip size are accommodated, and there's adequate spaces, particularly where assistive technologies are in use. Now, this is a very interesting principle as we're entering, I suppose, education where virtual reality and artificial intelligence is becoming a feature. Because the size and space and how we engage in relation to that will also have to be considered in terms of our diversity of learners and our diversity of students. So it would be interesting to watch this principle, particularly in that regard. So for our next activity, we have another short poll. I want you to think about a time when you had a problem and someone made it work, and just reflect on, in your own little head, I suppose. Think about a time that you were challenged. Think about it in terms of how you might break it down. What was the challenge? What was it that was causing you concern? Then think about maybe who was adding to the challenge. Excuse me. And also perhaps who was facilitating a solution to that challenge, and how that made you feel, and how the person who was bringing forward the solution, did they inspire you to do or be better consequently? And we all face challenges in our work, and we all, I suppose, lean on colleagues, lean on family, lean on friends. And I suppose in terms of taking assistance from others is something that sometimes we need to also relearn to do, being able to ask for help, being able to raise our hands and say, look, this is something that's new for me, and something that I might need to change. And the reason I want you to reflect on this as we go through this is because one of the key principles of universal design and universal design for learning, and it's something I've already said, is that it thrives on relationships. It thrives on multidisciplinary relationships and interdisciplinary relationships. That was where its very origins came from. And that is something that we need to appreciate and build on as we go forward, because our learners will benefit from those relationships. So as we start to think about ourselves and our learners and how we redesign our learning space, what we're doing is we're shifting slowly into that learning space. And we're thinking about inclusionary thinking. And we're thinking about inclusionary thinking where we're trying to create a world where inclusion is everyone's business, rather than a world where disability or difference is only some people's business. So we all have a responsibility in this regard. Similar, a little bit similar, I suppose, to recycling. It is also a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach. It's a model that adopts design approaches because it's redesigning in inclusive education. And I certainly know, I suppose, as I would have spoken to groups across Europe, very often in our learning space, people would sit back and reflect and think, yeah, you know, I'm doing a lot of this already. But sometimes what we're doing is we're doing it by accident rather than design. And what's more important is that we start to shift gears and start to do it intentionally as we go forward. And if something is working for us, you know, it may also work for somebody else. And this is where the relationships and community of practice very much start to develop. Inclusion, excuse me, design, universal design, and universal design for learning are very broad philosophies. And they do demand that they are considered from the very beginning. And this is a good time of year in many respects to be listening to a talk like this, because as we wrap up, I suppose, our work in this academic year, it means that as we shift into our next academic year, that we can reflect on, well, what is it that, you know, we can do for that new diversity of learners that are going to be in our classrooms going forward in August, September. We cannot presume it to be prescriptive, adhering to rigid guidelines. Now, this is something that's quite important because what has emerged a lot, I suppose, in the early years of universal design for learning was checklists, or how people might put approaches in place that might work. But we need to be very, very careful, because then we're shifting to a space where it's becoming a tick the box list and becoming quite prescriptive. And that, in fact, is harking back all the way to that medical model of disability. That is starting to take an approach that is static rather than active, and is, you know, pretty much saying, well, I fixed it, it should now work for you. And that is not necessarily the case. Universal design is not about realizing an end game or achieving a result. It is about engaging in a reflexive process that whereby there will be ongoing reflection in relation to inclusion in our learning spaces. And it is an evolving process, because it is something, I suppose, that there is a high level of research interest now in around the world. And it's being looked at and measured in terms of assessment. It's being looked at in research in relation to different curricula, maths by way of example, science, nursing, medicine, the humanities. And every time it goes in and is applied in a different place and space, it looks different, while it's still and all the time emerging or being informed by the same principles. So it's not meant just for any one particular curriculum. It's not meant for any one particular assessment type. It is an ongoing conversation, and it's a good time to be actually engaging universal design and universal design for learning. Because while there is still a lot of discourse and research in this area, it means that it is something that you can become part of join in and become part of the conversation from the very beginning. So it is an ongoing conversation, and it is a conversation that we expect to be ongoing for quite some time. So by way of example, in Ireland, universal design is now being mentioned quite explicitly in government policy. It's being mentioned in relation to education at primary level, post-primary level, higher education, and further education, which is vocational education in other countries. It's also being looked at in relation to early childhood education. It's being talked about in terms of the terminology can sometimes shift, and I am going to touch on that in a few minutes. But I suppose while that is the broad policy piece, and it filters right down into our classrooms, and I too teach and I too assess, is that very often people think, well, I can't respond to everybody. And it's true, we can't. I too am a researcher and a teacher. And I suppose it's stopping to think about this in the context of our learning environment. And it's And this is where we bring in the inclusion triangle. And we think about, well, what does it look like? And I have in front of you there on the screen an inclusion triangle, and I've adapted it slightly. There is another one that I developed, and I would point you through. I was involved in writing the strategy of universal design for learning for our further and education training sector here in Ireland. And there is a very nice model on a triangle that I developed with my colleague, Dr. Patricia McCarthy, in that publication. But certainly in terms of the inclusion triangle, I developed this a little bit here because I think this is how I feel it can be in my classroom. And this is where at the bottom of the triangle, universal services or universal curriculum is where we're designing, where we're aiming to be beneficial for all. But with the best will in the world, we won't always meet everyone's need. So the next layer up on the triangle is where we group people together with the same need. Now, I would argue that this is a space that needs to be looked at and considered more. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But grouped need would be whereby people who have similar challenges can be supported together. So perhaps students whereby in my country, where they might be studying through English and English isn't their first language, where they have severe dyslexia, where they have a visual impairment, they could all benefit from the same grouped need. And they would have targeted services to meet that grouped need. Tier 3 is where there's individual services, and that's services that are specific to one. That can be your piece of assistive technology, or it could be your person aid, or it can be even your guide dog. Excuse me, by way of example. Now, what's interesting when we look at this triangle, and I think very often people move to position students either at the bottom or at the middle or at the top, is that the student could be at the bottom for one class, but they could be at the top for another class. So depending on the activity that the student is engaging in, their need can change. It makes sense, of course it makes sense, but it's not something that we always stop to think about. So this is why students don't become labelled as the person who needs a lot of support all the time. They may not. Not only is it the case that their need may change depending on their learning, it also may change depending on the time. It can be a situation that on some periods of time, they have a greater need than others. As a student shared with me a couple of weeks ago, there were certain times when they were just more economically pressed and actually had to go out and just work more on their part-time job because otherwise they couldn't stay in the learning environment. And they felt that at those times, they needed some targeted services, but it was only for short periods of time. Someone else with a chronic illness said there was times when they were just not feeling as good as they would at other times, and they would then slip into tier 2 and sometimes perhaps up into tier 3. But there is a need to start thinking about what our support system looks like, because the most important thing about universal design is that while we're designing for a great diversity of people at the bottom, is that it never negates the need for add-on support. And that need for add-on support is enshrined in legislation. So saying, well, I've universally designed it, it should work, you should be happy, which is where I suppose unconscious bias can kick in, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of consideration, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the answer. And this is why it's a continuous and reflexive process. Now, it is a balancing act. And I have been working for many years. I've been working with universal design since about 1999. And I suppose it's a balancing act. And it does cause wobbles, and it is challenging. And this is why communities of practice are very beneficial, because it's in the collaborations with your community that you're able to share the challenges and that you're able to kind of work out, well, what's going to work, what's not going to work, or where perhaps, we might find ourselves challenged in terms of, I can't change that piece of the curriculum. I just can't. These kind of challenges. So we're able to tease out what can and what cannot. It does not mean we cannot maintain standards. Of course we can maintain standards, and standards is what our learners are choosing to engage to learn. It does not mean that learners will not fail. If they will, and that is part of the learning process, but we're not setting them up to fail. What we're focused on is their success and optimizing their success. And when we collaborate with our communities, we can actually include learners in that community. and include learners in relation to what they think and what their ideas are and their feedback. And that can be very useful indeed. So in terms of as we shift from universal design, and the reason I shared universal design with you is that that is the foundation, that is the roots, that is the tree. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there is a number of frameworks that were developed from those first 7 principles for the learning environment. Excuse me. And I suppose what we need to think about in relation to those principles is we need to appreciate that they're design principles. And there are so many people that have taken them and looked at their environment and thought, well, does it work for me? And maybe how will I modify it to work for me? Because that is the essence of design. It's a bit of upcycling, I suppose, or a bit of, adapting or adding on, or maybe taking something away. Because education is also cultural. And we all need to appreciate what it looks like, the curriculum is like, and how we engage in it in our own space. So taking something off the shelf, universal design came from America. It came from, an architect with a physical disability, but he was very cognizant of his environment, and that influenced his thinking. The principles that you see here in front of you on the slide, or the frameworks, are a number of frameworks. And the first one that I suppose we all would be quite familiar with is, and if you're not, I would encourage you to look up the website because it is one of the most popular ones, is the Universal Design for Learning Framework from CAST. And it was developed by Myers and Rose back in 1998. Now, Universal Design for Learning that was developed by CAST was developed primarily for what we would call post-primary or secondary school students with disabilities and quite significant physical disabilities. And it was, I suppose, in consideration of their needs for that curriculum, that learning environment, and that assessment. And in the early days, it was really more a reflection of how we can design those learning environments to include the technology that those young people need to learn. And it was when they put together their community of practice in CAST, and they included a number of disciplinarians, that they started to see if they shifted from their focus from teaching to learning and concentrated more on neuroscience and the active learning, that they could develop a framework that would work for a great, I suppose, diversity of students. Now, the CAST framework, while it was developed for post-primary level, was adopted in many regards by the higher education system in Europe, and ironically is possibly adopted more in Europe at a higher education level than it is in America. Now, I can be corrected on that, but certainly going back 10, 15 years, that was the case. But we need to be aware, again, that its origins, it's a very useful tool. It is continuing to develop, and I'm going to look at it a little bit deeper in a few minutes. But it is a very, very useful tool, and it's that shift from teaching to learning is particularly useful. Universal Design in Education was another framework that was developed by Bow. Universal Design for Instruction was one of the first frameworks that was actually developed by Scott and Maguire and Shaw in 2001. And that focus was actually on higher education. What they did was they took the 7 principles and they added an eighth principle. And then they started to develop a 9th. Universal Instructional Design, UID, was developed by Higby in 2003. And there was 2 others, Universal Instructional Design, again by Palmer and Caputo in 2003, same year, and a Universal Design of Instruction by Berg-Stackler in 2007. And Berg-Stackler is a very big name in this space as well and has written extensively on universal design. And I think where the shift has been going for a lot of people is that there is a universal design in education. And there is we can learn from all of these frameworks and all of these models, but certainly here in Ireland, what we tend to adopt is universal design 7 principles and universal design for learning in terms of CAST. But there is merit if anyone is interested in looking at all and just appreciating the background. So as we move forward, I'm going to take a deeper look at universal design for learning because I think it is the one that tends to be a little bit more easily understood and appreciated. And it sits, but we do need to appreciate that it's a bit like a tree in terms of the roots are universal design and universal design for learning are the branches. And what CAST did was they identified 3 pillars on their framework. The first pillar was the why of learning, and this was about student engagement or learner engagement. How interested are my learners in what I'm teaching here in the classroom? Are they engaged? Am I motivating them? Are they actively participating? Do they believe that they can contribute to my class, if appropriate? The second principle was the what of learning, how learners gather facts and categorize what they see. In essence, this is the active space of learning. And this is curriculum. Is my curriculum set up so a diversity of learners can actually get what they need to learn? And can they see it? Do they hear it? Can they engage with it? Is it lab work? Are the tutorials they're attending supporting their learning, etc.? The third pillar is about strategic networks, the how of learning, how learners organise and express their ideas. And this, in essence, is assessment. And for many, the assessment piece can be the hot potato. I suppose the interesting piece about the Universal Design for Learning is, if we go back and look at its history, it too is evolving. And there was a time when the framework was actually organised the other way around. The what of learning being number one, the how of learning being number two, and the why of learning being number three. And you'll often see, if you Google it, that might even pop up on a search. And it was actually following a conference in Dublin Castle and work with CAST in Dublin, and your colleagues, I'll give a shout out to Alenka from Slovenia, were at that conference and contributed as well. And many years ago, the conversation started, and CAST went on and developed it further afterwards as to, the why of learning. That pillar was often, I think, and still can be, I suppose, what I would call usefully misunderstood, if that's okay. Because in one instance, it can be looked at in terms of, are learners interested in my class as I engage in delivering my class? Are they motivated? Are they turning up? Are they participating? Do they feel like they can belong in my classroom? But also in terms of the wider aspect of engagement. Are they happy to be on campus? Are they happy to be in college? Can they engage in library services? Can they engage with technology? And that engagement piece, it has been growing tentacles and widening, particularly since COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement in America. And CAST now have been looking at that further and doing further development on their framework in this regard, because what they started to recognise was we need to consider maybe our language, our curricula, our image, our representation in the classroom if we're going to ensure that learners start to feel like they can belong and that they can engage in a positive way. Just giving a little nod to the book, Andra Tesha, an author from America, contributed to our book and spoke of an equity well check. Stopping to reflect on and think about, do learners believe that you've really considered their engagement before they actually come into the classroom? And do they feel like they belong? Not just that they're there, but they feel like they deserve to be there. So in terms of, while a lot of this has been, I suppose, developing in practice and certainly being advocated for and has been mentioned in policy, in terms of what the literature tells us, and this was something I took a look at when I was doing the further education and training strategy and when I was doing my PhD. Universal design and universal design for learning is, in essence, coming from a design process. While universal design for learning adopts neuroscience and also, builds from Vygotskian thinking. Universal design for learning is an approach. It's an active approach. It's not an end result. It's not something that you do and it's done. It is a way of being and a way of teaching. It's a practice. So, and I suppose the hint is in the word practice, in that it means that it's reflexive and we continue to consider our practice and to develop our practice, while remembering that there is that tolerance for error piece built in as well, because otherwise it's going to be very challenging. However, we do need to remember that it was developed in the main for teachers and pedagogical practices and curricula in America. So as such, we have permission to take it and develop it for ourselves. And that is the beauty of design theory. And I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, upcycling, stopping to think about it in terms of our university, our curriculum, our classroom and asking ourselves, well, what is it going to look like here for my learners? What is it going to look like for me? It is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, while yes, it's been around since the 80s, gathering apace since the 2000s, and I think, you know, for many reasons is being adopted across policy, but it is new. So the research that's emerging in this space is new, and there still can be resistance, and sometimes even in terms of where it's positioned in relation to the literature and the journals can be quite interesting when you go to read it. But it is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach. And it's, you know, it's embraced by very many disciplines. I've already seen it applied to nursing. I've seen it applied to professional teacher education. I've seen it applied to the sciences, to arts, to maths. Excuse me. So, you know, it is, and in each space and place, it looks different. Of course it will. But it's still got the same end goal in mind all the way. So just a quick look as to what it might look like in terms of that pillar of representation. This is something that I've used that with other learners when I've been lecturing on UDL, is, you know, just 7 actions for successful UDL lessons. And it's taken, you can see there, from a UDL lesson planner by Patty Kelly. You know, the first thing is just making sure you have your learners' attention. Ensuring that they can see it, hear it, but also that they can act on it. You know, that they can take it on and make it their own. Ensuring that their learning is relevant. And sometimes this is maybe even setting out why they're engaging in this learning, where it fits within the context of a course, what matters, and how it will be relevant to their future thinking or practice. Making it meaningful borrows from that also, so that, you know, they can see and appreciate and critically think about what they're engaging with. Ensuring that they connect with it, that they own it and they make it their own. If they can apply it, it's all the better, even in terms of a project, in terms of representing back to the class and doing a flipped classroom, in terms of if it's relating to professional practice, that they can basically take it and apply it in terms of what they're doing and their actions as they go forward. And I think the key thing is making their learning matter so that it feels real. And I can appreciate that this can be quite challenging in and of itself, because what it's doing is it's shifting the emphasis, I suppose, from where, certainly when I was in college, and it was, you know, a question of here's your notes, here you learn, you know, you can learn this. Sometimes even I, as a learner, would have thought, does it matter? And the dots needed to be joined and it needed to be set out for me as to why it mattered. I was learning a theory from the 1950s, perhaps, etc. Also, with respect to assessment, and this is, I suppose, one of the greater challenges, is that we need to start respecting that all learners express what they know differently. Some people are very good at expressing it verbally. Some people are very good at expressing it in written format. Some people are very good in doing it in a timed environment, and others may find timing challenging. Excuse me. Preparation for assessment is key in this space. I mean, learners should know from the very beginning of a course how they're going to be assessed. And the curriculum should be built around that so that they can plan and you can plan, that there can be practice, that it can be organised, and sometimes, where possible, that there can be choice built in. There isn't one means of action and expression that works for all learners, and providing choice is necessary. Now, many years ago, there would have been conversations around, you know, do exams even need to be timed at all? Because any student that is struggling is, you know, probably left in the shortest amount of time. And those that need extra time, you know, they're not going to stay on for an unnecessarily long length of time. So in some Nordic countries, they actually started introducing, where time wasn't a core competency or a core requirement of the exam, you know, they started to introduce untimed exams. I haven't heard much about it since COVID, to be honest with you. I was more familiar with it before COVID. And COVID shifted, I suppose, a lot of thinking in regards to assessment, because Also, where people have been told they couldn't do or take exams online, there was exams taken online, such as even Vivas for PhDs. In terms of continuous assessment and what that looks like, and the use of technology. And I think in Ireland, particularly now that AI and ChatGPT is becoming much more prevalent, that move to people expressing their learning in a classroom environment, so that, you know, teachers have a sense of what students are actually learning. We're almost shifting back to that. So this multiple means of assessment could actually serve many purposes, including, I suppose, working with a diversity of learners. And I think it's going to be something that is one to watch. Obviously, for professional courses, there's always going to be professional standards. There's, you know, set ways for doing assessments. And that is something that we work to and work towards and build a learner's capacity to engage in those assessments. There is no suggestion at all here that there's any shift to standards. Standards continue to be fair and equitable. They continue to have to be attainable. And learners want that too, because they all want to know that they have attained or reached a standard. So it's not about shifting the goalposts in any regard. So just as we reach the hour, a quick poll. And it was something that's been said earlier on. 2 questions. Do you think UD or UDL is just for people with disabilities? Is the first poll. Okay. We might view the results of that poll if people are happy that they've voted.
Yes, the results are in.
Right.
So for the question, do you think UD or UDL is just for people with disabilities? We got 100% for answer no.
Yes.
So everybody responded that way.
Very
And
good.
for the second question, do you believe it is an approach that could work for all learners? We got yes 93% and no 7%.
Very good. And I'm very interested in that result. And it's something perhaps we can, because I'm going to leave a little bit of time for discussion. And I do hope that you will use your voice towards the end. I'm very pleased actually that we've got that 100% result. While I know not everybody voted, and I respect that, and people, you know, sometimes need to go away and think, because while we've embraced universal design and universal design for learning here in Ireland, and in fact we have a government, we've the only semi-state body in Europe, certainly I think in the world, we have a UD centre here in Ireland, that's government funded, but looks at universal design across society, not just education. Still in Ireland, I can hear that universal design, you know, that's an approach for people with disabilities. And I think for people in the education environment, if we're going to start adopting approaches for every single cohort of students, it's just like too much hard work. We do need a framework that we can use to kind of bring in the other approaches that we like, but something that works for all. And being allowed, or enabled to redesign what we do in that regard is good. In relation to whether it's an approach that works for all learners, we can come back to that. And I think it would be interesting to think about, and I would be interested maybe to hear if someone wanted to put in is, who are those learners, or what is the curricula that maybe it would not work for? Because I might have some thinking or learning in that regard, but also it will add to my own learning. One of the things that I wanted to take on to, because I think it's really shifting on that kind of, I suppose, exclusion piece. And I mentioned back at the beginning of the presentation about inclusion rethinking. Exclusion is a big issue, and there's another issue coming down the road in relation to the cost of exclusion. In a recent OECD report, they were looking at student dropout rates. And they reported that 12%, in the Netherlands, 12% of students dropped out within their first year. In Spain, 1 out of 5 students dropped out. The cost of the dropout, Spain have put a cost on this. The cost comes to 395 million euros. And as I said to another audience recently, I could do an awful lot with that kind of grant money in higher education. In France, 59% fail to complete their degree, and the highest dropout rates happen in first year. And in Ireland, while we're saying 63% complete their degree, you can do the maths and you can see that we also have a high dropout rate, and it's a growing issue here. 1 in 3 students in higher education seriously consider quitting, but the reasons that they consider quitting are financial, personal, and other factors. And very many people believe that they don't belong. Now, there can be an awful lot of work done. And I mentioned that my focus in relation to my research is also transitions and career guidance and how people inform their choices and how choices are informed. But fundamentally, if people don't feel it's for them, or they don't feel like they belong, or it's becoming too much of a challenge in relation to all the other factors in their life, it's not just costing them. And it's not just costing us. Increasingly, what it's being found is that it's costing education, and there's actually a monetary value in this. So we need to maybe start to think about universally designing our environments in this context. I worked with Dr. Patricia McCarthy, my colleague, here in Ireland recently with Trinity College Cork. And this came, we shared this slide and there was much discussion around this. And at the end, one of the students highlighted that, for very many of them, they were trying to manage daily lives, caring responsibilities, working responsibilities around their learning responsibilities. And there was a decision made in that university there and then, that going forward, all lectures would be recorded to facilitate that kind of a learning environment. Now, I wait to watch it and see how it develops. Because students are using their phones and everything recording already in Ireland anyway. I don't know what it's like in Slovenia, but what they're moving to do is control that. And also they will, control attendance. Indeed, my own son is in college. He feels that's not a good idea. It's an interesting one to watch and see, where do we sit within making learning available to people if they can't be there for whatever reason, or how do we measure attendance? Does it become a core component, etc.? But one of the things that is very, very clear is that it's starting to cost us if people feel like it's not for them. So what do we need to think about in that regard? We need to think about creating safe, welcoming learning environments. And again, and I'm not talking about it here this morning, but safe can also even mean around the conversations we're having politically, conversations that we're engaging in relation to critical thinking about what's going on in the world today. You'll always, I'm from Trinity College Dublin, the students have quite a strong voice there recently. And, there was a lot of thinking about, from colleagues and from other learners in relation to some people feeling maybe this doesn't feel as safe an environment as it should at the moment, and trying to manage that and work towards that, because everybody needs to feel welcome in the learning environment. So we're starting to move then into difference as opposed to just disability. Allowing time for self-reflection. Anything that is built on design thinking or change thinking or transformative theory is going to ask that people need to be able to self-reflect, because what we're looking for here is a change and a cultural shift within learning environments. Encouraging individuals to engage and respond so that there is voice, that there is learner voice, that there's the academic voice, and that there's other voices, because there is so many, in third level, there are so many other places and spaces that are involved in that learning process. There's the library, there's the clubs and societies, there's internships, there's work placement with companies, so that all needs to be considered. Making sure that those need support to engage are offered it. And that's back to the grouped and the individual piece. So not only that it's responsive, but maybe that they know in advance where they can get it, should they need it, so that they can take control of it. And that also includes researchers and academic staff being able to access and avail of support, should they need it in that regard. Including individual, partner, small group and large group activities. So using, I suppose, all those tools at our disposal in this regard, and this also means working across disciplines as well as just within our own discipline. And I would have found with my co-authors of the book, Dr. Patricia McCarthy and Professor Conor McGuckin, was that we found that if, rather than moving straight to the templates and checklists of UDL, which are extremely useful, and, there's an awful lot of ways that can be applied, but even just starting to think about how we can create that safe, welcoming learning environment that will optimize learning for all students is a big shift in gears forward. Which is why I suppose it brings us to our third and final step in this regard. And it's back to that kind of, I suppose, image of time, because it does take time to put it all into practice. There is no doubt that it takes time. It is making connections takes time. The connections can be within your own institution. They can be across your country. They can be across Europe. I'm happy to connect with anybody who would like to connect after this talk. We all, I suppose, are challenged by time, but how to make time effective and make time matter. Consider the intersectionality of people, considering the intersectionality of people with regard to our learners, but also our colleagues, because as we change our perspective and more learners come through, what we're finding is that those learners are now also our colleagues. So we now have within the academia workforce people with difference in disability, and we also need to be considerate of that. So as we would say in Ireland, we need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So it becomes our way of doing and being. It is very important that we consider where advice and expertise fits in. All too often over the years, I suppose, when I've been working with people, I've often been met with, I was told by, or I was told this is the way to do it, so it's the only way I can do it. Things change, and we've certainly seen a lot of change over the last couple of years, but things change, advice changes, and I suppose it's being sure that we're getting our information in this regard from reputable and informed sources. And, a call out to yourselves, because you're from across the academic environment. There is a greater need for more disciplines to get involved in this conversation, because there is a need to continue to develop different approaches all the time in relation to culture, in relation to learning discipline, in relation to student cohort, etc. And this is where I would point to the Sustainable Development Goals, because this very much supports such an approach, because without going into each one of the goals, but number 4 there in front of you in the image is quality education. Number 10 is reduced inequalities, and I know that there is another for fair and equitable work. And higher education has its tentacles across all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but in every single Sustainable Development Goal, they talk about inclusion. And really what they're looking for is a more sustainable approach for including, because it's only together as we build communities that we can actually change, I suppose, the trajectory or the direction as we go forward. So as I come to the end of the presentation, because I wanted to allow a little time for people to be able to engage and maybe ask questions, I would say to you, and it's back to that nice song, you can all Google it and listen to it afterwards, maybe take a few minutes with a cup of coffee. It's, you know, taking the time and appreciating the time that it takes to engage in this conversation. Because in some ways, some things will always stay the same. Hence, I use the line, you know, watching the ships roll in and I watch them roll away again. A colleague many years ago, when I was starting my own, I suppose, work in this space, and I was a colleague from the Netherlands, he said to me, it's a bit like going out and getting a bus every day. That, you know, you go out and you stand at the bus stop, the bus comes, you get on the bus and you go to your destination. It's the same bus, it's the same bus stop, it's the same destination. But every day, the people are different. Sometimes you meet the same people, sometimes a different bus driver, sometimes the weather is different, sometimes the conditions are different. And it's being able to appreciate that sometimes we're always back at the beginning, but there is always a change. So we did the book over COVID. I like to think of it as a useful resource for starting the conversation. The first 4 chapters pretty much look at the history, look at the development of universal design for those who like theory, the development of universal design for learning, and in context as to how this is even impacting on disability services in higher education. And then as we evolve through the book, it starts to reflect, and it has contributions from other people in other aspects of university life from around the world. It starts to think about, you know, what does this look like for the librarian? What does this look like for the PhD researcher or research fellow? What does this look like in relation to technology? What does this look like, or how do communities of practice work in this space? So I suppose it's an easy read, we like to think in Ireland, introduction. But there are 7 key principles that we ask people to take away. And it is, you know, thinking with care, which is what I was saying at the beginning, appreciating your own understanding of inclusion, because we all have a belief in relation to who should be in or who should be out, and maybe stopping to think about that and adopting an ethical approach in that regard. Also then shifting towards the design and embracing that opportunity to design in an inclusive environment, you know, because you're changing the culture in your classroom, but as it gathers momentum, you're changing the culture across campus. So it matters both bottom up and top down. Recognizing exclusion and being able to maybe challenge it or work to it or redesign to it, and stopping to think about how it can be addressed. And continuously rethinking and redesigning in that regard. Now, I can share, as also somebody who teaches in that, you know, it takes a bit of time if you're shifting to do this for the first time. There's no doubt about that. But after that, it's rather than traditionally where we would have responded and that took the time in our response, what you've done is you've front loaded, you've anticipated, the work happens at the beginning. And afterwards, other than stopping to think about it and reflect on it continuously, you're then building on a fairly solid platform. And take the time to engage with others is the 7th one. Use that broad ecology. I mean, really, I suppose what the book is, and what we were saying is, in adopting a UDL attitude, because it's a way of thinking and a philosophy, we would say that you're adopting a new approach for universal design in education. Hence, you know, the idea of using the word nude, which in English means bare, was it's a little bit to that kind of redesign thing. We're stripping back something to its core principles before we rebuild it up again and make it fit for purpose. There is a book voucher there for a discount that the publisher has kindly shared with me. If for any reason it doesn't work and you want to use it, please just email me or let me know. So the final poll, if that's okay, before we engage in a few minutes of chat, if Marus is happy to run with that, is, you know, just stopping to think about, is UDL a new approach? And I'm really talking about, is it a new approach for you? Now that you've listened to the talk today, even if you knew about it beforehand, do you believe maybe coming in September that it's going to lend, you know, is it a new approach for you? And then do you think of UDL as a one-off action or habit? Okay. Have we results, Marusa?
Yes, the results are in.
Mm-hmm.
So we got for the first question answer yes, 50-50, yes or and no.
Very good.
Yeah,
Okay.
and for the second question, we got 30%. They're saying yes. Oh, I mean, one-off action, and 87% says habit.
Okay.
So
Very
the majority of the
yes.
answers.
I'm just going to stop my presentation here. Yes, and I can appreciate there might have been a bit of misunderstanding around the question. It is a habit, and there is no doubt about that. That's where the shifting is thinking that while there is a number of templates out there, and that was the initial approach that a lot of people moved to, certainly here in Ireland and America and across some other countries in Europe, they're starting to see that, you know, you were at risk of excluding people if we apply an approach and stick to it, believing, well, it works now. Or as people in Ireland would, or, you know, may have said a number of years ago, I've applied UDL, it's done. It's never done. It's a reflexive, active process. So good, yeah, in terms of the 50% new approach. It's great to think that there's colleagues in Slovenia who are already embracing it in their work and that there's others. So you have certainly a community of practice that could be started there, which would be a very interesting piece of work to do. So has anybody any questions or comments, even challenges for me? I don't mind at all. I can't promise I'll have all the answers, but I'll certainly endeavour to do so. You can pop them into chat or you can show your face and have a conversation. Anybody challenged by what I said? Anyone like what I said?
There appear to be no questions in the chat or no raised hands.
Very good. Okay. I suppose so as we're winding down, I mean, if people have questions afterwards, they can contact me. But if anyone has a final comment they'd like to leave me as a takeaway with before we wrap up, if they wanted to pop chat, that would be great. Anything anyone would like to share. And